Donc, c'est quand vous êtes prêt, je démarre le temps quand vous commencez.
Parfait. Donc, bonjour tout le monde. On est super content d'être ici. Merci de nous accueillir si tôt ce matin pour essayer de rendre la présentation le plus dynamique possible. Donc, on est la firme WeBuy. J'ai ici mes collègues Alex, Luca et moi-même, Émilie. Donc, on est ici pour discuter du cas d'une potentielle acquisition, Easy Rent. So, the stock market is filled with individuals who know the price of everything, but the value of nothing. So, juste une petite expression qui illustre un peu notre philosophie à WeBuy. On ne va pas baser nos acquisitions sur ce que le marché dit, ce que le marché pense, qui est souvent biaisé et qui, dans le cas de Easy Rent, était un peu défavorable, mais vraiment sur notre analyse fondamentale à nous et les risques et potentiels qu'on voit dans la compagnie. Donc la présentation va se poursuivre en anglais, puis évidemment à la fin, si vous avez des questions, que ce soit en français ou en anglais, ça va nous faire plaisir de répondre dans les deux langues. So first up, going to our agenda for the day, we will first go over the mandate overview so that we really understand what are the questions we're trying to answer today and where are we going. Then we'll go over the company and industry profile to understand really the market overview. We'll go over the three specific mandates and finally an action plan. So the mandate overview. So as I said, we're here for a potential acquisition of Easy Rent, which could potentially provide really high return for our private equity firm, since this is a really high-growing company. So we had three clear mandates. The first one was the valuation of the company, so that we know what is the fair price if we really want to go forward and buy the company, and the ratios, so that we can compare it to the competitors that are also in this market. The second mandate was to restructure the governance around the company, which was a huge issue in this case. And the third mandate is to recommend a portfolio for the company that would be appropriate for the risk and for hedging against potential risk for the company. So, the company profile. So, Easy Rent has the goal to provide the best rental office space in the world. So they are in the office space or co-working industry, which is a relatively new industry. It's becoming more and more popular in North America, Europe, and even in emerging markets. They have been in operation since 8 years. Their business model. So what's important to understand is that they will be taking long-term rentals from well-known big real estate companies, and then they will be subletting it at shorter rental terms. So what can be a potential issue here is that they're locked in into their long-term rental agreements, and if the market is not beneficial for them, they're locked in. So that's something that we need to keep in mind when we will build our portfolio later on. Now the product, it's really modern co-working spaces, and the clients are usually startups, entrepreneurs, and recently they've been also opening to very large firms with really large rental spaces. So the competitive advantage, they have a very efficient management of their workspace, they have competitive costs, and they have a personalized services that not every competitors offer. They also have a very good community, which is something that the CEO was really keen about, and that makes it important because when you work in co-working spaces with other companies, that's when you can make contacts, that's when you can network, and that's also a big competitive advantage for any co-working space company. So the future projects, Asia expansion and raising capital. So that's basically why they thought of going into an IPO or raising capital privately, because they want to expand. And the risk, so there's many competitors in this market, there's basically low barriers to entry, and they require an occupancy rate of 85% in order to be profitable. So the market concerns. So as we said, the company was thinking of doing an IPO, but then they stepped back because the market had some concerns. And basically the two concerns were the gap in governance and growth management issue. So the gap in governance, the CEO has a questionable behavior, which can be a huge concern if you're an investor. There's no governance committee, so basically the board of directors is really small and is comprised of is made with mostly people from inside the company, which is also an issue. And these are all things that we're going to address later on. And the growth management, so they are projecting 15% growth this year, which is huge. They've been in operation since 8 years now, and this can be a concern if they're trying to grow too fast and expand without taking into account the risks that are appropriate. They have operating lease agreements of 3 billion, so they're locked in this 3 billion agreement. And they're taking, yes, as I said, they're doing longer term operations to major companies, which is something new. It's really profitable, but it's also really risky, because if the big companies decide to renegade the contract or opt out, then they're stuck with this huge space. And they also have assets held for sale, like a private jet, which is linked with the CEO risk-class behavior. So we're now going to move on to the valuation, and I'm going to pass on to Luca for this analysis.
Exactly. Thank you. So in terms of valuation, what we did is we looked at the 4 ratios that were asked by you to value companies. So we can see on the map right after that we did a football field valuation where we used price to sales, price to earnings ratio, price to book, and EV to EBITDA, sorry. And what we did is we have a target leverage, so equity ratio that we'd like to obtain of 80%. So we looked at the justified multiple that we obtained, and we applied these multiples to the earnings that would be realized with the adjusted equity ratio. And we have an average price of 21. Also, there are some valuations like the price to sales ratio that have a very wide gap. This is why we don't really, the price was lower after the adjustments, but we're willing to pay more because it's a high growth industry and we believe in the earnings power of the company. So now we'll just go into the details of the valuation. So first of all, the assumptions at first, what we did is for our cost of equity that was required in some of the valuations, we kind of backward engineered from the WACC that was given to us of 5.75. So what we did is we looked at the debt weight and equity weight to find their mix, and then the cost of equity was found with the beta, the average beta of the industry, so general real estate with a market risk premium that is for AAA countries, so United States, Canada, and most countries in Europe, which is where we mostly operate, and the risk-free rate, which is an average of the current risk-free rates in Canada, USA, and most countries in Europe that are pretty low. Also, on the other side, we can see that we looked at some ratios. So the return on invested capital, the reason why we really like this ratio is because it's really a measure on how the capital that was invested in the business is performing. So in this, what we're accounting for, there are some people that don't use goodwill in ROIC, but we use it because we know that it's capital that was paid. So it's a kind of way to judge management's performance. Also, we looked at incremental ROICs. We didn't have the back years, but for our assumptions, we knew that with the growing business, we obtained 57%. Then we looked at ROA and also DuPont analysis. So we did a 5-way to really know where the business was. And we can see that the equity ratio, so their leverage, is a really big factor in the ROE. We want to reduce it a little, so we can expect the ROE ratio to go down to about 50%, which is still something that we really like as an equity provider. So then on the next slide, we'll see for the EV to EBITDA ratio. So what we did is calculate the EV to EBITDA with the 4 companies that we had. There is one company that was a kind of outlier, so it's a community with a 21 times EBITDA multiple. We had to take it out when we calculated the average EV to EBITDA. The reason for is because what they're doing is they're renting office spaces for groups of 10 people or less, which means that they'll typically rent smaller places, maybe not in office buildings, maybe in more rural parts where businesses are smaller. So we believe that the business model was different enough to be worth removing. The 3 other, like Home Office, Hub, and Best Rent, were all companies that were on average comparable. There's no perfect comparable, but on average it was enough and convincing for us. So using it, we arrived at the price of 35.45. The reason why we like this ratio is because it's a good way to see the businesses without their leverage, so how are they doing in terms of operations. But one con of this ratio is that it needs the assumption that everyone has the same exact business model and that they all do the same thing, which is not really true. Then we looked at price to book ratio, which is our preferred ratio in this business. So just because we own real estate, we thought that the price to book ratio was the best one to use with the assumptions. And here we use a justified multiple. So it was easy with the values that we had to find it justified. So we found a 36.53 price, which is adjusted down once we make the adjustments for the leverage that we want to make. On the next slide, what we see is the justified price to sales ratio. Again, with these values, we found a price of 24.55. What we did is run a sensitivity analysis on the price. What we like about it is that it doesn't take into assumption the operations of the business. So we can see just from a marketing perspective or from how they provide to their clients how much sales are they able to get. But one con of the ratio is that we can't really see how their operations are. So do they have a competitive advantage, allowing them to have higher gross margins, or are they good in streamlining their operations to have better margins at the bottom? Is not considered in this ratio. But we were able to get a price of 24.55, which adjusted down gives approximately $20. The reason why we pay more is just because we think that the operations are good for the company. Lastly, the price to earnings ratio, again justified, and we ran the same sensitivity analysis, but we ran it with terminal growth rate of 3% and the WACC that we found. The reason why we took a 3%, we were sitting between 2 and 3%, which we think are two reasonable perpetual growth rate assumptions that we can use. And because of the high growth in the industry and the increasing desire to rent office space instead of buying, made us decide that 3% perpetual growth is good. But this is also one of the cons of the ratio. It just assumes that the business will continue growing at 3%, and at one point the market will saturate, it will stop, and we can't make the assumption that they'll constantly steal market share from their competitors. This is one thing we don't necessarily like about the ratio. But overall, our adjusted price, what we'd be willing to pay for the business would be around $21 per share. Thank you. Good. So now what we're going to do is the restructuring plan for the governance. So things that we want to implement would be to put two committees, so an audit committee and also a compensation committee. And what we really care about in the executive compensation committee is to make sure that our intentions, or the intentions of the directors and the management of the company, are aligned with ours. So we wanted their compensation to be tied to two ratios, specifically ROIC and operating free cash flow per share. The two reasons is ROIC would be for the long term. So if we're going to provide them with capital that they'll invest, we want to make sure that this capital is well invested and that the person invested in the best ways for us to profit. So this would be our long-term measure. And in terms of short-term measure, what we want to focus is on cash flow. Why? Because we want the management to realize the importance of generating cash for our business. At the leverage that we have, or the leverage that we suggest, it's still very important to generate enough cash to be able to pay for our fixed costs. So this is why the free cash flow per share is a measure that we like in the short term. In terms of board of directors, what we would want to add is 2 new independent board members. We would like to be able to provide one, whether from us or by contacting the other holders of the company, like Blackstone or SoftBank or other holders that own big shares, and be able to put pressure with them to have a board, to have a member on the board. And have Ellie Murray, which is a very experienced finance person in the team, to be on the board to support the CFO and the CEO, who might not have necessarily the same experience as he does. And basically the other committees will be formed as 2 independent directors in the compensation committee, just to be sure that the management are actually accountable to outsider shareholders. And the audit committee would be Ellie Murray for his experience and another independent director.
So thank you, Luca, for this deep dive into the valuation and the governance. Next up, we'll look at the third part of the mandate, which is thinking about the portfolio, the size of the assets, and what we should do with proceeds. So how to invest them, what kind of return we expect, and the vision going forward on the portfolio portion. So the current outlook is that 9 of the past 10 recessions have been actually predicted from 6 to 18 months out by a yield curve inversion, which happened last year. So late last year, the 10-year rate actually went under the 2-year rate, which usually is a harbinger of a recession to come. And we think this is a very important consideration in terms of the investment policy for the portfolio. Secondly, we can see the VIX, since 2020, the beginning of the year, has been steadily increasing, actually for the past 3 months. And again, we think that this factor, in combination with the upcoming US elections, will lead itself to a harder than usual stock market and increased volatility. So we think that the portfolio should adopt more of a defensive position to hedge against these incoming events. So for that reason, we think the current policy, which I'll go over briefly, including 100% of the funds in money markets, so these are usually very stable, short-term borrowing and lending, but they don't usually return much, so low volatility. The expected return is usually 1 to 1.5%, marginal, as outlined in the case. Finally, the We Buy firm has determined that this policy does not suit the vision of the company and that the fund should be reallocated to a portfolio that brings more. So the proposed policy we came up with was to diversify the portfolio into multiple asset classes to match the risk-return profile that we seek, namely fixed income, utilities and infrastructure stocks, which we classify as defensive, overall defensive strategy owing to this, and the goal would be improved portfolio performance overall in line with our objectives. So on the left, you can see the current portfolio, which is very undiversified, entirely in the North American geographical region, and 100% money market. We propose a mix of assets, including US large, mid, and small caps, treasury instruments, such as fixed income, and then a given portion in the global market. And that would be Europe, Asia, and the Pacific Australian region. Finally, some European small market caps. And we think that this should hedge against potential downturns in the North American market owing to the upcoming election and increased volatility. Another example of which is in China. We recently saw the coronavirus, and we think that the market sell-off wasn't exactly due to the virus, but was an excuse that the market used to kind of, let's say, shed some weight. And we think it's a harbinger of events to come in the stock market. So for that reason, we propose the following breakdown. Fixed income, which provides stable returns and lowers your portfolio risk. Defensive equities, as I mentioned, in utilities and infrastructure, both in Canada and the US. And a hedging strategy, because if we place funds abroad, we're exposing ourselves to FX fluctuations, and we think it's a good idea to hedge against that. All in all, we ran this through a portfolio optimizer and sought the criteria of minimum variance optimization, which yielded an expected return of around 8.5%, a Sharpe ratio of 1.11, and a standard deviation of 5.32, which we found to be fairly acceptable for the mandate we're given. So increased returns and a comparable risk for the portfolio overall. And I'll pass it on to my colleague for the implementation timeline.
Yes, so thank you, Luca. So all in all, we've seen that AZ Rent seems like a really promising investment, but we really want to make sure we do an extensive due diligence before we go forward with that acquisition. If the due diligence is in fact successful, then we're going to go into our main condition for the acquisition, which is the change in the governance, and we want to find the independent members right after in 2021 and apply with the change in the compensation towards the end of 2021. So the key takeaways. So all in all, we recommend the acquisition at $21 per share. The only condition is the alignment of the board of directors with the incentives with the company's success. And finally, we've also removed the investment policy to attain the targets and ensure the success of the company. So thank you, and we will be more than happy to answer any questions you might have.
In English or in French?
Yes.
Attendez-moi juste un petit instant. OK. Vous pouvez y aller.
Je vais revenir sur l'évaluation.
Oui.
Est-ce que vous êtes à l'aise avec le français ou...
Oui, 100%.
Je vais revenir sur l'évaluation. Pourquoi vous avez choisi le Justified Ratio? Pourquoi vous avez choisi ça? Vous n'êtes pas parti avec les suivis après la...
Exactement. Donc, une des raisons pour lesquelles on a débuté avec le Justified Ratio, c'était pour ne pas prendre en considération nécessairement le prix que les gens vont payer. Donc, ce qu'on ne veut pas rely trop dessus, c'est quand même combien les gens payent dans le marché. Donc, on ne veut pas avoir toute une valuation qui prend ça en compte. Et si jamais les gens payent trop ou payent pas assez pour les compagnies, on ne veut pas nécessairement prendre ça en compte. Donc, on y va avec des métriques qui sont à la compagnie elle-même. Et après ça, on s'en sert pour les comparer. C'est pour ça qu'on avait un ratio comme le EV to EBITDA ratio, un petit peu pour avoir un genre de guideline, puis un base, savoir les gens sont prêts à payer quoi. Parce que après ceci, si on a à vendre notre position, il faut que les gens puissent, pour qu'on ait des acheteurs potentiels. Donc, on se sert de celui-là pour comme backer nos faits, mais pour les autres ratios, on aime ça plus se servir des plus justifiés. Ouais.
Pour vous, c'était pas important la perception des investisseurs à entendre votre argumentation, c'est-à-dire que parce que les investisseurs, ils ont une perception sur les entreprises et dans l'impli. Selon vous, ne voulez pas trop se baser sur ça, c'est ça?
Non, ce que je veux dire, c'est pour ça qu'on a utilisé le ratio EV to EBITDA en utilisant la perception des investisseurs, mais on ne voulait pas avoir nos 4 ratios basés sur cette perception-là. On s'était dit que c'était trop reliant on qu'est-ce que les autres sont prêts à payer, et on ne veut pas nécessairement acheter un equity au prix que les gens sont prêts à payer. Dans le fond, on ne veut pas être the last idiot in the mountain, t'achètes et après ça, c'est le genre de la ligne où est-ce que avec le dernier idiot qui achète. Donc, c'est ça, on ne voulait pas trop rely sur eux, mais quand même avec les
Les market concerns que vous avez point out, c'est le New Long Insurance Operation qui major companies. J'aimerais entendre peut-être votre vue. Est-ce que vous pensez que ça augmente le risque davantage de la compagnie? Vous pensez que c'est un nouveau changement d'affaires? C'est quoi votre appréciation?
Le long term.
Long term, c'est les nouveaux baux un peu plus long terme qui ont fait des compagnies qui sont déjà installées.
Donc, on pense que ça peut être un potentiel vraiment intéressant parce que c'est des grosses compagnies qui sont stables, contrairement peut-être à des startups qui peuvent du jour au lendemain cesser leurs activités puis qui a beaucoup de roulement finalement. C'est une industrie qui peut être beaucoup plus stable, mais qui en même temps implique beaucoup plus de capital puis beaucoup plus d'investissement, donc c'est là que le risque est. Ils ont commencé déjà un peu à le faire, ils ont dit qu'overall, ça avait été profitable. Donc, on considère que c'est quelque chose, c'est une direction dans laquelle ils devraient continuer d'aller de l'avant parce que ça pourrait ramener beaucoup de profit.
Le break-even de l'entreprise, c'est 85% de taux d'occupation. Comme vous avez mentionné, le marché est un peu incertain. On pense peut-être qu'on a une crise financière dans les prochaines années. Comment vous voyez ça, le fait d'avoir un break-even aussi haut, puis avec une santé économique qui est assez précaire, qui pourrait avoir moins d'entreprises serait portée à louer?
Donc, c'est quelque chose, en effet, qu'on est très concerné. C'est pour ça qu'on recommande de baisser un petit peu le leverage de la business et pour s'assurer, qu'on ne soit pas autant reliant sur nos cash flows pour pouvoir payer les fixed income. En baissant le leverage, ça nous donnera un petit peu plus de lousse pour payer nos choses. Parce qu'on voit la business un petit peu comme un double whammy, un couteau à double tranchant. On loue des business au long terme, donc on s'embarque dans des long duration obligations en théorie, et ce qu'on fait, c'est qu'on les loue à court terme. Donc, si jamais les taux d'intérêt changent, les taux qu'on charge pour louer dans le marché changent rapidement, mais s'ils changent pour le bien, c'est super bon pour nous, fait qu'on profiterait, ça serait un genre de leverage. Tandis que s'ils changent au négatif, ben là, on est pris pour, par exemple, avec 30 ans de long-term obligations, puis on loue à moins cher. Donc, on voit ça comme quelque chose de dangereux. C'est pour ça que la crise économique, c'est quelque chose qui nous fait peur, et on veut vraiment delever pour ça et embarquer des gens indépendants sur le board pour s'assurer vraiment que toutes nos décisions sont alignées et qu'on focus sur la survie de la business à place comme de rêve des deux gars qui la gèrent.
Dans cette optique-là, est-ce que la croissance en Asie, ce serait quelque chose que vous feriez ou plus?
Donc, une des choses qu'on aime avec ça, c'est bien entendu la diversification. C'est sûr qu'il y a certains risques. Donc, on aimerait ça, la croissance en Asie, mais on sait qu'il faut prendre notre temps. Ce qu'on voudrait, c'est probablement avoir de l'intelligence là-bas un petit peu. Donc, peut-être avoir des partnerships.
Donc, je vais devoir vous arrêter. La période des questions est maintenant terminée. Malheureusement.
C'est bon.
Merci.
Merci beaucoup.
Merci beaucoup.